Hello, welcome at Classix Festival, first edition. A contemporary classic affair, a very nice touch. We were at the first discussion one-to-one at the festival. We will talk with Peter Tornquist. I will say something about his biography until now, and then we will start a conversation. And during the conversation, you can, of course, you are invited to write down some questions if you have, and send them over, and I will read for him. Peter Tornquist is an international composer and principal rector of the Norwegian Academy of Music, Oslo. Tornquist has a Swedish background, but was raised in Switzerland and Brazil. He moved to Norway in 1984 to study composition with Lasse Thoresen at the Norwegian Academy. Since 1st of August 2013, Peter Tornquist took over as new headmaster of the Norwegian Academy of Music. Peter Tornquist, welcome to Iași.
Thank you very much.
I have a large question for the beginning of our conversation. What does classical music represent in today's music?
Well, before I answer that, I would only apologize for we need to do this in English. My Romanian is still not very good. The role of classical music today is, in many ways, you could say that classical music has never been as big as it is today. And we like to think that classical music is an endangered species, like an elephant that is dying out, but it's not. If you think back and you just look at the gallery of the lords here up, yeah, going back to the 1600s, 1500s, classical music has developed from being something from the elites to the masses. Classical music has developed from halls like this into concert halls, into the private homes of people, and now classical music is everywhere in the private life. Most young people relate to classical music through this today, which means that smartphones, which means that classical music is everywhere. But at the same time, it is naturally competing with a lot of other forms of music. So classical music has gone from being one exclusive, sort of very high part of the period to being a part of the base. But in that move, it has actually been democratized and it's available to everyone. And this is a blessing, but also a huge challenge.
20 years ago, being younger than now, I had this talking with a friend of mine about classical music, and we reached this level of composer like Shostakovich, Prokofiev, I don't know, some Bela Bartok, and ask ourselves, who will be the next composer? What the music sounds like in the next period? We don't have a clue. We didn't have a clue
no.
Back then. And found out, we learned about Polish composer, Penderecki, Pederecki, or something like that. There are two, actually.
There are many.
And we didn't understand anything of their music. What can you tell us about this kind of feelings?
You know, if I knew who was going to be the next Prokofiev or Shostakovich, I would hire this person as a professor in my academy today. So we don't know. But what we do know is that some of the music being written today will be considered classical tradition in 50 years. Some weeks ago, I attended a concert in Thailand, in Bangkok, with the big Thailand Symphony Orchestra. They played the entire music of the Harry Potter film, the first Harry Potter film, live. So with the movie and the orchestra playing it live. And there were 4,000 people in the audience. And they sat quiet for 2.5 hours and actually cheering every time something, but listening to what is essentially classical music played from a live orchestra. Now, this is John Williams. You have Hans Zimmer, who's already another film composer, and you have a number of composers writing for video games today that we don't hear about, but I can tell you that our kids listen to that music, and they adopt that as a classical tradition. In addition, there will be a lot of different experiments crossing over between jazz, improvisation, folk music, popular music. We don't know, and we shouldn't know. But you know, classical is something also that it cannot be defined in time. Mozart was not a classical composer. He was a contemporary composer. Prokofiev was not a classical composer. It becomes classical because you find that it stands the test of time. So there will be something of today that will be considered, and it will be played by the Philharmonic in Iași also, hopefully.
All right. In your childhood, what did you learn about music in Brazil?
Oh, well, you know, I lived many places, but I lived some important years in Brazil, and it's actually a very good question, because one of the things I discovered in Brazil is that talent has really no boundaries, but talent depends on the cultural setting you have. So you will get different influences. In a place like Brazil, and there are many countries like that around the world, music is such an important part of everyday life that rich people or poor people will meet around the same music, and they will play the instruments that are necessary. So for instance, piano is not a very big instrument in Brazil. Guitar is a very, very big instrument. And then it goes also guitar in jazz, in popular music, but also in classical music, because it's available and it's part of the culture. But these guys, Brazilians, they play football all the time and they play music all the time. So it's a reflection of their way of being. And you can see some of that in Italy and as well, or in Spain. So culture means a lot, but talent is equally divided.
Okay, thank you for this. Back to the hard questions. To what extent the music universities shape the music industry?
They, you know, this is a double question, because it assumes that we actually shape music, the music industry.
And you don't?
We have to, and we should shape the music industry, but that means actually training students not only to learn exactly what the industry needs today, but also training students to be artists and agents of change. Take, for instance, an opera house or a symphony orchestra. If we, as music educators, were only to replicate what the orchestras tell us, oh, we need to have violin players who can play in tune and very fast and shut up and listen to the conductor. We know that this is not going to be the future of the symphony orchestra. The future of young musicians tomorrow is to be as good technically as they can be. That's the same thing today. But increasingly, they need to have creativity, they need to be good at communication, they need to be good at collaboration and critical thinking. They need to know why they are playing classical music or jazz or folk music. And this is where music universities come into the play, because we have to shape the students so they become the artists of tomorrow. And that will change the industry.
Right. What is the role of music education, and how can one benefit from it, even if working in a different field?
Like jazz or... Yeah, I think the most important role of music education is exactly preparing young talents for the future. You know, I always think of conservatoires or music education institutions as a place where you're polishing diamonds. You know, diamonds they're already there inside a crude stone. You can't see them, or sometimes you can see, but we can help give the diamond a shape and a brilliance so that it increases the value. And this is related to these skills: critical thinking, creativity, communication, collaboration. But also, it's related to the fact that young musicians today, they don't want to play only one sort of music. The best classical performers, they are also curious about playing other genres and not necessarily meeting other people who play the same thing, but they are interested in meeting people doing other things. So together they can create some sort of new things. And this is also important for not only meeting other students. Increasingly, music students are looking at universities, at technology departments, informatics, students of psychology, students of IT, because they bring different perspectives. So this is all about this idea of expanding your mind, opening your mind, because the musical life of tomorrow, I mean, classical music, jazz, folk music, will always be there, but the conditions of the profession are changing. And the best students understand that.
If a student wants to be a composer, and he wants to write good music, and ask you something about how to do it, in which area, maybe he tell you, I have a lot of limitations. I can't be Mozart, I can't be Hans Zimmer, I can't be Peter Tornquist. What should I do? What would you tell him?
You have very good questions, you know. It's a very... First and foremost, it is important that you don't become a Mozart or a Hans Zimmer, and you have to become yourself, because otherwise it's really not interesting. At the time of Mozart, there were 99 other composers at the same city writing music that sounded similar to Mozart, but he and 3 or 4 others are the ones who survived, because they had a personality, and of course they had knowledge and talent in addition to that. So if you would become a composer today, and amazingly, there is no lack of talents. I mean, we keep getting a lot of young people coming and saying, I want to be a composer. And I tell them, but do you really know what you want to do? There is no job. You have to create it from scratch. And yes, but that's really what they want to do. Then I would say, try to be as broad as possible, know as much as possible, understand your time, understand your audience, understand the technology that is available today, which is amazing, but most importantly, work together with bright performers. So working together with the musicians, because you're not writing actually for the audience. It's the performer. The performer is the one communicating with the audience. And if the music can become like the ownership of the performer, then it will communicate. So this is what the composer needs to do. And this is how it works also in popular music, you know. The big songwriters today, we haven't heard about, because they are working in studios, they are producers, they are writing music for some artists that Rihanna or Beyonce, they go out and perform the music. But the guys really getting the money are the people writing the songs.
Okay. I remember that a few years ago I've read something about Rossini. I don't know if it's fact or fiction, but the story is like that. He used to go in the audience when concerts were in a city and watched the people when they clapped or when were cheered something, a piece of music or something like that, in order to compose in the same manner, to get the sympathy of the audience. What would you tell us about a technique like that?
The
method.
We don't know if that is true or not, but it's a beautiful story. And the story also is that he disguised himself, so he would, because he was a famous man, so he wasn't recognized. But I think Rossini did something like that, and I think it was quite usual for the other opera composers to do that, which is exactly what we do today with social media, YouTube, Google Analytics. We keep tracking, we keep looking at what works, what does not work. Popular music does that all the time. And tracking record sales, tracking downloads on Spotify, it's also a way of, okay, this works, this doesn't work. But you should not only do that, because it will be an artificial way of actually understanding your audience. But you should definitely, as a composer, not disregard the feedback from your audience. But be prepared to challenge and surprise your audience regularly, because otherwise it won't work. But this same tactic is still being used today in the field of musicals, because it's so much money involved. So when they set up a big production of Les Misérables, in a new production in London, they will do like 15 performances before the premiere, and they will have people there looking at the audience. And they will say, okay, oh no, this joke was bad, this song is too long. So it's there.
But we can't imagine Beethoven doing the same thing.
No, because you couldn't hear. And you heard the piece by Beethoven yesterday, it was far too long. No.
Music studies. Why should one choose folk music over jazz or classical?
One shouldn't, and one still does that. Students still does that because we, as institutions, we are formatting students to choose one program over the other. In my academy, we have just last year introduced a completely new bachelor program, which is called the Free Bachelor. And we have flipped the coin, or flipped the camera. We don't look at, okay, we have these teachers and we have these programs, how do the students fit? No, we look at the students and we look, what is your talent? What is your artistic idea? How can we help you develop as an artist? And some of the students we took in this very first year, they are, they might play the jazz saxophone as well as they play classical saxophone. Why should we make them choose and limit themselves? So we are trying to keep everything open. So increasingly, we will see that young people coming to music education today, they will go to have a bachelor degree in music, and they will have different tastes. Or even more so, there will be a degree in music performance that will include also some theater, technology, film. We don't know, but we certainly know that we need to try to imagine a professional education for a profession that still doesn't exist, and not formatting people too early is a very important part of it.
Okay. The teaching method still differ from one country to another. In what way Norway or Scandinavia are leading the way regarding student development?
Well, I think probably the festival director should answer that later, because we are privileged by having one of your best students or performers as our student. You know, it's difficult to say exactly what is the difference, but I think what the students tell us is that we, in our academy, or I think this goes for most of Scandinavia, is exactly this shift of perspective. We try to look at the education from the point of view of the student. And, well, I like to use the image of driving a car. It's like, even if it's a slow, small car you're learning to drive, or you're driving already a rally car, yeah? You, as a student, you need to be actually at the driving wheel. You need to make the decisions of how fast, when to brake, when to turn. But in the seat beside you, you have a very knowledgeable, experienced driver who has a map and can tell you, okay, there is a turn, there is a left or right, you make the choice. But this will lead you this way and this will lead you that way. So having the student in the driver's seat actually making the choices, that is one of the pedagogical sort of philosophies we have. And sometimes this is difficult for our teachers because they have learned things in another way. And you know, in the field of violin or piano, principally, it's always like that, you know, my teacher teaches the way his or her teacher learned, and this goes then back to Beethoven, yeah? So at some point everybody learned from Liszt or Beethoven. And this is still true. I mean, there are still some ways of playing the piano today that have not changed. But we would do a very big failure today if we didn't allow a piano player to also experiment with playing on old pianos, playing cembalo, playing on synthesizers, and being able to play jazz. Even if you're an expert in Beethoven, that would be a big failure. And no teacher can do that alone. So the idea of one teacher and a class of students, that is very normal still in many parts of the world, but that idea is being challenged. And I think my institution is challenging that a lot. I think Dragos would concur. Hopefully, I don't know. Yeah.
Peter, how should we deal with our own capacity of concentration, of focus? I ask you this because we are now used to listen pieces of music for 3 minutes, 4 minutes, maybe 7 minutes length. And symphonies, the operas, they have 1 hour, 3 hours, or 3 hours. What tips and tricks can you give us about how to focus, how to stand still in a hall and listen to music? The classical music.
The classical. I think the first one is to make sure that these are closed, and because this is actually it's a great tool, but it's doing something with the attention span of young people today. Not only young people. I think, in fact, the younger generation is better equipped to deal with it than we are, because we are so fascinated by it. But, you know, I think there's also a myth in this. Everybody attends a movie that is 2 hours, 2.5 hours long, and never complains about, oh, wow, oh, good, I slept after 20 minutes, so this is too long. You're still able to read a book, a novel of 500 pages. Oh, okay, you might not read more than 20 pages every day, but you're still reading it. You still keep the focus over long term. And, you know, this is a very blasphemic analogy, but in fact, a great lot of people enjoy watching 2 times 45 minutes football. You know, and 45 minutes is a long time. It's the time of a Beethoven sonata. And most people would die during, oh, do I really? Oh no, there's another movement. Oh God. But 45 minutes watching intensely, 20 players very tactically. Or like I told you when we were discussing this initially, one of the big developments in broadcasting in TV is e-games and chess. Chess is huge in broadcasting in TV now, and you can imagine. I mean, just imagine a game of chess when nothing happens for 20 minutes, and 2 sweaty people just sitting and looking. But people love it because, and this is the interesting thing, is because there is an added value. There's a story being told. Someone is telling a story about, oh, if he moves the bishop, then this happens. And you start thinking, oh, really, would that, and why doesn't he do that? And then computers can simulate what would happen. And suddenly, bam, you have the bishop moving. And then after just 30 seconds, the one makes a different move, and you're sitting there. Classical music can learn a lot about that. About not only telling people that, welcome to the concert, now you're stuck in this chair for 2 hours. If you're lucky, there's intermission, then there's champagne in the lobby. But now you actually have to listen to something. Now, I think one of my most fantastic experiences in classical music recently was one of our professors in the first day for the first year students. I gave a speech introducing, welcoming the students, and this professor was going to talk about something, interpretation. And he sat down at the piano and played a music that I had never heard. And no one of the students had ever heard it. And it was a long piece. 25-minute sonata by Fanny Mendelssohn. And the idea was to say, okay, fantastic music, nobody knows what it was. Nobody could see. I was even thinking, because this professor is also a composer, I think, is he making up that? Is he improvising? What's his point? And you could see the students listening to that and trying to process, what is this? Oh, is it romantic music? Is it Schumann? No, could it be some American composer? You know, it's exactly the same thing. Oh, what if the bishop moves? And then suddenly something new appears, and then they realize, the story is, this is a composer that never got her music out in public. So this is a piece that is a fantastic piece. So you don't listen to it because you know this is a sonata written in 1848 by this and this composer. You listen to it as music. And I think classical music, and this festival could have a huge potential in this, classical music can communicate by actually telling stories in a way that we are not usually doing today, and not the normal story of, this is a great masterpiece which is 100 years old. No, this is simply music. And these young performers, they are not the ones who have won 3 competitions or 5. No, they are just fantastic musicians. And they are perhaps playing together for the first time. So concentration is still there, but we need to understand that we need to shift things around. And again, classical music still has this power, but it's going to change.
Okay. One more heavy question, and then an easy one. International cooperation. In what projects can music university enroll together?
In what projects can they not collaborate? That's more the question, because music is one of the most international disciplines there is. Of course, it's a cliche to say that music is an international language, but it's also true. And especially classical music is now developing in parts of the world where it hasn't been big. China is currently the biggest country for classical music. It's the biggest market. It's the country with the most symphony orchestras, with the most performance. Dragos, I hate to tell you this, but there are 40 million Chinese pianists with an education. Yeah? Not professional players, but 40 million who have had an education in piano music.
One in 2 Chinese young students learn how to play violin for the piano.
Exactly. And this should not be a challenge, it should be an opportunity, because it means that 39.5 million of these people are very good listeners, because they know exactly what it's all about. So in terms of collaboration, it is easy to set up collaborations internationally between teachers and between students, because they all work with the same material, and there's no need for translation. Increasingly, and this is another important thing, if you think about the 21st century skills, which is creativity and communication and collaboration, we can all benefit from having international students. In my academy, we have, well, at the master's level, we have a majority of international students, 60%, and the school as a whole, it's around 40%. But each and every one of those is extremely important, because not because they are much better than the Norwegian students, but because they create a benchmark. So every time we get a clarinet player from Spain, the other students learn, this is what the level is. Because they will be competing for the same jobs, and they will be playing for the same audience. So collaboration in the field of music is extremely important, and it's also easy to achieve, because you only need to set 2 string players together, and literally there will be music. But it's also difficult to get a lasting, long-term partnership with institutions outside the country. But this is why one of the major developments that is occurring now is the development of strategic partnerships in the field of music education. So you're not strong as a one big institution, but you're strong as a partnership of institutions. So even the big ones like the Royal College, Conservatoire de Paris, Vienna, and Oslo, we are constantly engaging in partnerships.
So we have to be aware and watch the power of networks.
Networks is everything. But it's not only music. In media, networks is extremely important. Airlines are in networks, but all the disciplines, also research. If you want to get big money for research today, you cannot do it alone as a university. You have to go in partnership with different. And so networks mean a lot but it also affects actual music, the basic music education.
Peter, let's go to literature. What is your, or who is your favorite character who is a musician?
Oh, who is a musician? Yes, I think you will find in Thomas Mann the most interesting descriptions of the musicians.
Dr. Faustus?
Dr. Faustus, yes. Not it's because my favorite, but it's because it's a very accurate description of what a composer is, what a musician is. But personally, I have found a lot of inspiration in James Joyce. And I'm thinking particularly in Ulysses, because it's such a good representation of the creative chaos of the modern day man. But also in one of my favorite authors is Franz Kafka. It's because it's not because we're all paranoid, you know, but it's because it's the little man working against the big systems. And that's such a good description of how tradition sometimes becomes problematic in the field of art and in the field of education. So yeah, I think those would be my answers. But you know, I'm in the latest years I've been much more fascinated about reading non-fiction, history, and authors like Steven Pinker that we also discussed briefly. It's because so much is changing in the world around us. So in order to understand our positions, you need to understand history. We have just recently reopened our relationships with China, because China was a closed country for Norway because of political reasons and the Nobel Peace Prize, but we recently have opened up partnerships there. And it's totally impossible to work with China if you don't understand the history of China. But once you understand that, it's so much easier to go beyond the cliches of, oh, it's capitalism or it's communism, is it good or is it bad? You go beyond that and see, no, you're dealing with like thousands of years of history. And frankly, being in a place like this, in a city like Iași and a country like Romania, you cannot escape the role of history and the role that this region has played in developing all the culture that is what we today call the Western tradition. And understanding that needs actually reading it. So I've been much more fascinated about the real history than fiction, but you cannot escape both of them. I love to read.
There are any questions from the audience?
Start, of course. You mentioned earlier about for young composers that to know your audience. Now, contemporary music is very popular, especially in Oslo, mainly because of the Roma Festival, which is huge. And I'm asking you now, Peter, is there an audience for contemporary music? Do people listen to contemporary music when they're coming home from work? Or is it something that we must experience live? And if there's not an audience, can you build one of contemporary music?
So this was not one of the easy questions, yeah?
Yeah. Of course.
I think we have given you too much critical thinking, Dragos. No, you know, the short answer is of course there is an audience, but again, it's not the same sort of listening. One of the things we do wrong with contemporary music is trying to make it behave as it was Mozart or Beethoven, and putting it in a concert hall and expect the audience to sit and enjoy it, and actually enjoy it as something you would put on. on your, I would be afraid if anyone was sitting in the train listening to Luciano Berio or Ligeti. I mean, they shouldn't, because that's not what you do. But contemporary music is like a lot of contemporary art. It's not a decoration. It's not something you have because it looks nice on the wall or because it sounds nice. It's because it's going to challenge you. And this means that you have to develop other ways of interacting with the audiences. Sometimes it's about not telling that, oh, now you're going to listen to contemporary music, but just putting bits of contemporary music juxtaposed to other music is a way of refreshing things. And one example of that is young soloists who write their own cadenzas for a Beethoven concerto or a Mozart concerto, and sometimes challenge that stuff or improvise it as it used to be. Another very interesting experience I had, which was totally unexpected, was many years back in London. I attended a performance of the St. Matthew Passion on Easter Day, or the Friday actually. It was and you know, in the middle of it, they had introduced a very modern a cappella motet, which was sort of just a comment about the music, and it made so much sense. And it then, because you had just heard 1.5 hours of Bach, that you know every single note and you love it, and you can you know exactly what to expect, and suddenly you're thrown off, and there's something new. Why? What? And you have to think, why? What is this trying to tell me? And then you get another hour of Bach, and you suddenly have filtered that Bach through a contemporary expression, and it makes so much sense. It's like putting a painting of Renoir beside a painting of Picasso. The one affects the other. So it should be challenging, but it should not be the same experience. And a lot of composers and performers doing contemporary music don't understand that, but the best ones do.
There is a question there, please.
My name is Marian. I work in Radio Iași, which is part of Partener. I think that Norwegia is the main issue in this series of
Seems to be, yeah.
debates, which is a great idea to be included in the festival. I noticed not too far ago that Norwegia is also the main partner in the programs of Minister of Culture in Romania. In almost every program, Norwegia is present, which is great and very rare. This is why I would ask you about your cultural policies internationally. A little bit of overview about your partners. You mentioned China, but I suppose Romania is not a very special partner.
Well, you know, I think Romania is one of the countries that is emerging as an interesting partner for many European countries. It's not only due to Dragos, but I think well, there's good diplomatic connections. Romania has been more active in promoting its qualities than some other countries, but also, you know, Norway is not a part of the EU. We decided not to be part of the EU, but we are in fact Europeans, and we are part of the, of course, the European Economic Area that introduces some possibilities. And I think partnerships, as I mentioned earlier, partnerships in the terms of networks, partnerships are also important when you have to deal with cultural budgets, issues of bureaucracy, issues of learning from each other's. In terms of the new European countries, I would say we have a strong relationship with Romania, of course, with Poland also being a close partner. The Baltic countries have been like the entrance to a lot of the former area of Soviet influence to us, because the Baltic countries are so close to us. But you know, fundamentally, it's all about, is there genuine connection on the level of culture? And once you realize, yes, there is, you also see that there is also a connection on the level of commerce. There's also a connection on the level of linguistics or academics. And suddenly it's all about saying that, is there potentially more than unites us than what used to divide us in terms of politics? And this is exactly the approach we have now to China. But there are other countries that form officially, there is Brazil and South Africa, and now Korea is also formally a preferred partners of Norway. But the real value comes from the partnerships that you can create locally. And it's things like this festival, and when ideas change, ideas travel minds across different areas of the society. And I would say Norway is a young country in many ways. Norway was a colony under Denmark and under Sweden for 400 or 500 years. So Norway has tried to assert its role and find its place. And we understand that we are very, very far up north, in the fringes of Europe. So we are only 5 million people. We need to be active and listen to the world, have a dialogue with the rest of the world. And most of the rest of the world is an interesting place.
Peter, I have 2 short, tricky questions.
Okay.
And we can end our conversation, I assume. If you could outlaw one genre of music, what would it be and why?
Bad music. That should be. Wow, that's the gist. What is jazz? What is classical music? No, I mean, music that has as its sole purpose to sell a product, which has no artistic thinking. I'm not against commercial music. In fact, if anyone would look at what I listen to, I might listen to commercial music, but most commercial music still has an artistic intention. But there is music that is being produced simply to fill supermarkets or elevators, or simply to keep us from concentrating, to fill our space. I would say that is bad music. But I wouldn't outlaw it. I would simply call it by its name, and it will disappear by itself. Yeah.
And the last question is, what kind of pieces of music makes you really, really happy?
Everything I can run to. I love running, so I'm always looking for music that I can have in my ears that makes me move. So that's what makes me, because I need that. But I'm generally listening to all sorts of music. Really, really. I mean, and I like to be very eclectic. about music taste because it enriches things, and which is something I also see a lot in young students. They cannot really, they shouldn't really define anything. But there is music in the classical tradition that will always make me really happy. And I would say almost anything by Bach really makes me happy. But what really makes me happy with Bach is the Brandenburg concertos. That gets me every time. It's fascinating.
Peter, thank you very much for this conversation. I wish you fruitful days in Iași, and
thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.